A lot of people aren't quite aware, even in the United States, that states are very different than the federal government. They don't have anywhere near the economic control that a national government has. In every case but Vermont, the constitution of a state basically prohibits deficit spending outside of borrowing for capital or sometimes cash flow needs.
To maintain kind of this fiscal policy, it becomes more obvious as to why there's such a drive for economic development and why trying to reshore these manufacturing jobs ends up being absolutely critical for these states. And tell me what it's like for these states that have these balanced budgets and how, trying to desperately kind of lower taxes to attract investment. How does that kind of play out in terms of quality of life, cost of living? Because I think Canadians have seen a lot of comparisons between, GDP per capita in Canada versus Alabama, Kansas, others. And on its surface, it looks like Canada's really fallen behind. I wonder how this plays out on the ground in those states.
I would say don't look at state GDP figures. I don't think they're very good measurements of what's going on at state level. I think they're better at giving you macroeconomic information for the nation. If you're going to compare a country like Canada to a particular state, I would look at things like median household income, things like life expectancy and other quality of life factors. That really is what you should be comparing.
To kind of meet those objectives of job growth, attracting investment, states also appear to be, more aggressive on tax policy, right? Lowering state taxes. How does that play out in the short run? And how sustainable is that in the long run as a strategy to attract business, to attract talent?
It's in our DNA that we really hate taxes. I know
I heard
people do almost everywhere,
Yeah.
But we had a revolution in part over imposed taxation from England. But what's going on, particularly at the state level, is there is a competitive situation. It's critically important to look at the entire tax burden that residents have in a particular state. That's often overlooked. There's usually a belief that things are better and the tax burden is lower in a state without an income tax. That's not necessarily true. When you look at things like the tolls that are paid, property taxes, sales taxes, other fees and local taxes, you could have a tax burden in what you think is a low tax state equal to what people perceive as a high tax state. Particularly for a lot of Republican and red states, there's a very strong belief among legislators and governors right now that they're going to attract economic development and it's better for the state to lower taxes, particularly income taxes and corporate income taxes as much as possible. I think we're going to see over the next few years how effective that is, because there's also the other side of the coin that's not always talked about. Taxes obviously pay for schools, roads, things that residents want, but frankly also businesses want and they need. They want to see, a business wants to see investment in a community college that might be doing training that provides the skills that the employers want and the type of people they want to hire. Also, I'll throw out the example of Kansas. Kansas did an extremely dramatic tax cut. They did not see the economic development they expected. And frankly, a lot of the voters and residents became upset because they saw cuts to things like K through 12 education, and they didn't like that. So I've certainly participated in discussions with business leaders, and they've made it very clear that taxes can be an important factor, but it's not the only factor. They look at quality of life. They look at who they can employ. Because you're right, they want certain skills. And I think what's really critically important, too, is to realize that there's kind of the whole package. One thing that's really important to business is not necessarily tax rates. What they're going to care about is if they're doing particular economic investment, are they, their particular business, are they getting a break?